Welcome to the Ukrainian Museum Canada's online conversation with Natalka Chomiak tonight regarding her exhibition, our exhibition, Folk Imaginaries, Ukrainian Clothing as Memory and Imagination. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that the Ukrainian Museum of Canada is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. And as always, we are very grateful to be on this beautiful land. And we hope that through our work here at the museum, we help to make the many communities that are living here more informed, more creative, and more resilient together. As many of you know, Ukrainians arrived here in the prairies starting at the very end of the 19th century. And the Ukrainian Museum of Canada was established in 1936 by the Ukrainian Women's Association of Canada. What a lot of people don't know is that we're the oldest museum in Saskatoon, and just by a hair, we're the oldest Ukrainian museum in North America. I started here as executive director in May of 2022. And at that time, this exhibition space that I'm standing in tonight, and I will be giving a little tour of the space as our conversation progresses, had one exhibition in it that had not been changed in any kind of significant way since this beautiful building opened in 1980. The display that was in here was well researched, and it included many of our most beautiful artifacts and a great deal of clothing as well. But it was in kind of the tradition of the day, the tradition of heritage museums, kind of stuck in 1905, I always like to say. It told the story of the first wave of settlers, and it didn't progress beyond that, and it didn't also really address the complexity within the Ukrainian community, the complexities, the kind of complexities that exist in every sort of cultural community. It was told from one perspective only, and it was a big deal for us to take down that show. We spent a year talking about it. We wrote a research paper about that looked at the idea of liberating this space from that frozen 1905 period, from that one single narrative. And this exhibition, Folk Imaginaries, Ukrainian Clothing as Memory and Imagination, is the third major exhibition that we have installed in this space since we took down the exhibition Sons of Our Soil in 2023. And once again, for the first time since we started to change this space up, which we do now on an annual basis, we have an exhibition full of clothing. And but this exhibition, as you will see, is conceived in a very different way from traditional heritage museum exhibitions. And it's one that all of our visitors so far, since it opened at the end of September 2025, have found so delightful and so inspiring. And we're able to tell so many different kinds of stories through the installations in this show. So, we do everything as a team here at the museum. Our exhibitions involve a huge amount of collaboration, and we are reluctant to call any one person a curator of our shows most of the time. But this show really, truly is the brainchild of Natalka Chomiak from Winnipeg. And we worked so very closely with her for probably a year and a half to bring this exhibition to life. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Natalka here tonight for a conversation about this show. Also included as curators in the show are Alexandra Shkandry and Rachel Ormshaw, but none of it would have happened without Natalka. So for those of you who do not know Natalka Chomiak was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, where she completed her secondary education. She moved to Toronto, where she studied Slavic studies, North American and Eastern European history. Active in the students' movement, she subsequently worked with feminist organizations and as a community development organizer in the Ukrainian community. In Winnipeg, she has worked in the nonprofit sector as a volunteer and board member. Sustained by love of art, craft, and fashion, she has pursued an informal education in these fields. And I have to say, on behalf of everybody at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, working with Natalka on the show, I think has been a highlight of all of our careers, because she's a treasure trove of information and good humor and delightful surprises. And I hope that everyone here who doesn't know Natalka gets a sense of that tonight. So, Natalka, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be asked to speak tonight, and more so to bring this exhibit to the Saskatoon Museum, to the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, and it's fitting because this museum really is, in some way, planted the seeds for this whole project to actually blossom and to find its place within the new revamped space that you have created in Saskatoon. Um, the one of my purposes in this exhibit was to encourage and to encourage people to take a second look at museum culture. And to think about museum culture in new ways. I was privileged to have a look through the stellar collection that the Ukrainian Orthodox women's community managed to create and to conserve and preserve in Saskatoon. And I have been personally, I have found it to be a wonderful feast for the eyes and food for the soul. And I hope that people who come and see the exhibit feel that they learn something new about something that they knew a lot about.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get into some of the concepts of the show and actual articles of clothing and talk about those. But I want to say that maybe half of the articles of clothing here come from the collection of the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. I actually haven't done a count, so I don't know for sure. And we do have, as Natalka says, we've got the largest collection of Ukrainian textiles in North America. So we have just so much clothing in our collection. And then we have a few items borrowed from other institutions and other individuals. But the rest of the stuff here, and it might be more than half, belongs to Natalka herself, and they come from her own personal collection of clothing. And so I'd like to know, Natalka, when did you start collecting clothing, and when did you suddenly realize you had it? When did you begin to realize maybe that you had a collection?
Well, I have to say that this all started fairly innocently. And how this project came about took a very long gestational period. So I was pregnant with this show for a very long time, and really, it didn't start out as a show. It just started out as two discrete and separate interests that I was pursuing in my life. One was an interest in fashion. And again, I come by the interest honestly. I grew up in a family and in a community for whom fashion was something that was organic and of interest every single day. And the women that I knew in Edmonton, from the matrons who would appear with cigarettes, hot pink cigarettes with gold tips and cigarette holders, to the young mothers that I would see in my community who knew how to dance a mean tango and dressed in the best brocades, to the women that I saw at community events. They sparked my imagination. They created a wonderful visual culture. And I would say, to sum up, that my community, like the Italian community, was very much a community that was, uh, that delighted in the bella figura. So the idea of dressing was something that was very organic in that community. And the idea of stepping out and looking good was just something that was part of my everyday. My mother and her sisters, like many women in the community, they knew how to draft their own patterns, and they cut and they sewed and they embroidered. They were very skillful dressmakers in their own right. And I knew lots of women who were had similar skills. I had a cousin who went on uh, to do museum studies and to be a founder of a dance group in Ottawa and then later in Vancouver. And she was a mistress of all things that had to deal with Ukrainian traditional costume. So it came to me organically, is what I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was also interested in fashion in general. I had fashionable sisters, and I loved the suitcases full of clothing that they brought back from Paris and London, and their rooms were full of Vogue magazines and Harper's Bazaar, etc. And so I was interested in this. When I went to university, I didn't have a lot of money, and vintage fashion was just beginning to be a thing. And I knew a couple of women, I would say, in the Ukrainian student community who really who really knew how to put on a performance in terms of the way that they dressed. And so I very slowly started to buy vintage fashion because it was, for a student, it was something that was possible. And I was beginning to immerse myself in museum and museum culture, and I was always interested in art. Uh, the decorative arts in particular. I started going to, as I traveled, I began to go to the big decorative arts collections in London and New York. I started visiting fashion museums, and very slowly, I would go in every city to the secondhand markets. And I started collecting. I started immersing myself in the history of fashion. And surprisingly, to my surprise, those two very discrete categories began to intersect. And I started to find the unexpected. I expected Ukrainian design to be part of my Ukrainian community life, but I didn't expect to see it on the backs of the Bloomsbury Group. I didn't expect, excuse me, the Parisian couturiers um, to be dipping into that decorative arts archive. And I was fascinated by it. And so over time, I began to see more and more of a crossover, and I began to ask the question, um, was anybody else seeing this, and why wasn't this being pursued by the fashion historians? Excuse me, that have been associated with the big arts museums and cultural institutions in the West. And I think that I was sort of in a unique position because I had those interests and I had some background um, in Ukrainian history and culture, that I was able to see where some of these intersections were beginning to take place. Um, as time went on, and as Ukraine entered into the mental maps of the West, this sort of the discrete intersections became something that became mainstream. Um, and after the Orange Revolution, and after, for example, Jean Paul Gaultier went to Ukraine and went for Euromaidan and went to the Ukrainian museums, excuse me, um, it became something much more mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
So out of that came a, a desire to collect examples of this crossover.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, slowly, both the both original Ukrainian traditional textiles began appearing more and more on the markets, and so did the products of the Western fashion imagination began to appear on secondary markets. And I began to purchase them for my own use or for my own pleasure. And as these things came together, um, I realized as a result of conversations with people such as my daughter Alexandra Shkandry that really I had a show. And she was working at the time at the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, and in the process of discussions of my collection, um, we put together a show.
Yeah, so
And
that's where it started for me, was visiting Osradok in Winnipeg and seeing mimicry and adaptation, which is a kind of earlier iteration of this exhibition without anything from our museum in that show, and I saw it there. Perhaps on my first or second visit to Winnipeg after I started here at the museum, and I thought this would be good. It'd be good to do this with our collection. But we made a lot of changes here. It looks like quite a different exhibition. And we had a lot of discussions, Natalka, about how to start the show and how to end the show in terms of a narrative. And so I'm going to do something a little goofy and carry the laptop around the room a bit. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how we start the show here. We'll just start. And what we start with in this space is this reproduction of Shevchenko's portrait of Katerina, and and uh, we have Katerina Ukrainian dress as resistance and identity. And so do you want to say a little bit about this for some of our audience that may not know?
I'd be happy to. So, if you are a Ukrainian Canadian, or if you're a Canadian without any hyphens, you will no doubt have seen Shevchenko's statues in your local city. I think in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto. Uh, we have Shevchenko monuments. And Shevchenko is, of course, the national poet. He is our Robbie Burns. He is our Northern Star, a cultural star. But I was interested in Shevchenko and the Katerina painting because I wanted to ask and answer a question. The question was, who decides what is Ukrainian clothing? And when we think of Ukrainian clothing, usually we think about traditional Ukrainian clothing from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And very often we think of the Poltavsky stri as the Ukrainian costume. So, how did that happen? And really, the answer to that question is that fashion is something that uh, is often really influenced by art, and by collecting. If you look at 19th century dress in a place like England, you will see many, many paintings of aristocrats in Oriental clothing. What does that have to do with English culture per se? Well, obviously, well, maybe not so obvious, but there was an Orientalist school in 19th century academic art. It was so appealing to the ladies of British society that they could not wait to put on turbans and harem pants. And a similar thing happened in Ukrainian culture. Um, Ukrainian culture in the 19th century was going through a period of self examination, and people were looking to the past to answer the question of who they are. And Shevchenko's painting of Katerina was purchased by one of the big collectors of Ukrainian culture, Tarnovetsky, and he uh, he created an enormous personal museum in his house, and he and Shevchenko here created the Vogue for Ukrainian peasant clothing. So what happened was that it became very fashionable to wear a peasant costume like the romantic heroine of this painting, Katerina, is wearing. This painting, we could have an hour's discussion about Katerina, about what she symbolizes, about what Shevchenko is trying to tell us. But what I was interested in was who gets to decide what is Ukrainian fashion, what is fashionable, um, who influences the eye? And the answer is that, of course, traditional Ukrainian women's clothing was produced by Ukrainian women, but they were also looking at theater productions, and they were looking at illustrations. And Shevchenko's Katerina really caught the imagination of it was a kind of viral image within 19th century Ukrainian culture. So therefore, we have Katerina at the start of the show. Then, as now, art and influencers set the tone for what is fashionable. Okay, I see we have lost Jen. But yeah, before we went after Katerina, after the image of Katerina, we have also the context. Katerina is the start of our show, and there is a context to this show as well. And again, it is tied to museums and collecting. We have three textiles, Baroque Cossack textiles from the Osiradok collection, and again, it shows you how long we have had needlework being carried out in Ukraine. And if you look at those textiles, they're quite different from the costumes that we start our show with. But they show you that this is artisanal production has a very long tradition in Ukrainian culture. The difference between those early textiles and the ones that we are looking at over here is that the status of women has radically changed. between that period of the 17th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So when those early textiles were produced, embroidered, Ukrainian women had one of the highest literacy rates in Europe. And when our show actually begins at the start of the 20th century, Ukrainian women had one of the lowest literacy rates in Europe. So, economics and politics is one of the sort of threads that run through this exhibit. Technological change, production of textile production, and the technology of the production of clothing is another thread that runs through this exhibit. At the beginning, there we have examples of we have some examples of embroideries from the museum's collection. When we think of Ukrainian clothing, I think very many of us think of red and black uh, uh, stitched stitched roses on linen. On linen shirts for Ukrainian women. I wanted to show through the selection of textiles and costumes here at the opening of the show that, in fact, um, we don't know a lot about the very rich archive of design and pattern that Ukrainian women produced in that 19th and 20th century. There are 112 different embroidery stitches that are utilized in Ukrainian material culture. We're used to cross stitch. And these patterns that Jen is showing will give you a few examples uh, of the very rich design that women were producing across the country, and that there are very big regional differences in terms of the aesthetic that they adopted for their own usage. So we start with a very beautiful, I think, white on white Poltava sorochka, and it has a very muted um, obhortka, and we have beside it here is one of our white on whites, and as Jen is moving along, she will show you another one on this mannequin here. Um, Again, I was animated in part in this show to answer a question that puzzled me. And that was, I knew a lot of very fashionable women, and basically their response to Ukrainian material culture was either they adored it or they abhorred it. And I was interested in why. And one of the answers one of the things that was interesting to me was how the absolute variety of Ukrainian material culture, and how we are so impoverished in our understanding of what that material culture is. I am very grateful to the women of the Saskatoon Museum for their work in putting together such an important collection. And I wanted to show just a few of the wonderful pieces that they have in their very well preserved and very and well treated textile collection. Um, And so, as we move past Katerina and we move to the clothing that women would have worn when they arrived in Canada, I wanted to ask the question: why did Ukrainian women and the clothing that they wore, why did it excite such a strong reaction from their fellow Canadian women?
So that, Natalka, that brings us to the corset, and
Yes,
that's something we actually got from the Canadian Costume Museum
yes,
in Winnipeg, and
yes.
it's an object of fascination for all the young people that come through here. But it's such an important story that we tell as part of the show, is the relationship to the corset and the shape of the female form. So continue.
So, when Ukrainian women arrived on the prairies, or in Toronto or in Halifax, they often brought with them their best clothing, and they would uh, put on their best clothing and put their best foot forward. It was shocking for the women of Winnipeg to meet these new Canadians in their clothing. So, what was shocking about it? Well, one you could, if you look at the clothing that the two communities are wearing, we have a linen, a Victorian Canadian linen mannequin right beside the petticoat on the other side of it. Both communities, women are wearing linen garments. But Ukrainian what the early Ukrainian settlers in the prairie region, for example, were wearing is that they were using the same textiles as their neighbors, but they were not wearing corsets. And they were not wearing corsets because they were working women. They were an integral part of the economy. And of their family economies. They were small landholders in Ukraine. They worked mixed agricultural production. They were mothers of many children, and um, corsets simply were uh, a garment that slowed them down, and that didn't give them the flexibility that they needed to do the things that they needed to maintain their families and their own well being. This shocked and horrified uh, their Canadian neighbors. And in Winnipeg, for example, we had a mission society that was organized in order to bring um, in order to bring the new Ukrainian immigrants um, into a more respectable mode of dress. For Canadian women, the corset was very much about morality and respectability. And for them, not wearing a corset was a sign of your uh, lack of respectability and your suspect morals, because once you were a teen, excuse me, you were expected to corset up. And so meetings were held. Oh, excuse me. Meetings were held, and mission newsletters were written, and an attempt was made to convince the newcomers to don the corset.
Mm-hmm.
When this happened, this was a cause for celebration, and pictures were published, and women were celebrated for coming into the light, if you will. Ukrainian women, on the other hand, felt that this was, only prostitutes and perhaps aristocrats were wearing corsets. This just did not figure in their daily life. And so, Canadian women thought that the Ukrainians were loose. Ukrainian women thought that women in corsets were loose or, not useful in everyday life.
It's a fascinating story, and it's interesting that the corset is coming back right now amongst young people. So even worn as outerwear.
It is. This is also. This is also a the women's the silhouettes. Excuse me, of women's fashion change over time, and the waist is often a focal point for design.
Natalka, we're going to try and keep the conversation to about an hour tonight.
Okay.
So we're not going to be able to stop at every installation here. But I want to point out that the after revolution folk inspiration in the 1920s, this beautiful little corner in the show always catches people's attention. And I want you to tell me just something about one or two of the pieces in this section, because once we get to the 1920s, we have a very different silhouette, and that Victorian corset is gone, and then these beautiful prints and patterns, appliques. What's happening here in this time?
Well, the debate over the corset is decided by war. And women went to war, and they left their corsets behind. And when the 20s started, the corset was retired, and women were needed in a new economy where so many men had been injured, had died, where women had played a very important role in wartime economies. So the idea of what women could and could not do changed. And ironically, the peasant shift, which was so horrifying to respectable women, became the silhouette du jour. So in the 20s, you can see behind you clothing that are cut in a way that is very loose, very free. No, the waist is not a point of interest. The coat behind you is an example. Yes, there's a coat behind you. It's a knitted coat. It's an American coat. And it is the beginning of one of the big waves of change in Western women's fashion. Ukrainian women were part of an enormous immigration from the Tsarist and Austro-Hungarian Empire into the West. And those women and men had to find economic opportunities for themselves. And the fashion industry was a place where many people found a place for themselves. And that coat, which was produced in France but sold in America, is an example of the influence of the avant-garde, the revolution, artistic revolution that was taking place in European culture.
And here I can see the influence of Sonia Delaunay, who was in fact from Odessa, and moved to Paris and incorporated. She made costumes, and she incorporated these vivid colors from her Ukrainian childhood, what the peasants were wearing, and so that just seems so apparent in these patterns.
Yes, so there was a very smart group of very talented artists in Paris who were working both in easel art, in textile design, and in fashion. and they were producing garments like that coat, which is a mid-range garment for a mid-range audience in the United States. Art dress was something that was being challenging the corset prior to the war. But after the war, the designs and the patterns from the East European Cultural Archive really went center stage in Paris. And in Paris in the 1920s, there wasn't a couturier or design house that didn't have a version of this kind of art dress and this adaptive design. The little dress beside you is an example of a textile that was produced for a garment that was sold in the United States. And it's a dress that you could see a pregnant woman wearing, but the textile is the star. And if you look at it, the pattern is very much in the tradition of block printing, and the actual designs themselves. You see those designs over and over in Ukrainian textiles. So it's interesting that Eva of Hollywood is suggesting that you might want to wear a dress like that.
And so the show moves on. We go through the age of uniforms, adapting Ukrainian clothing in the 1930s and 40s. And then we look at the 1950s and 60s as well with the Vyshivani Vechvanitsi, the embroidery evenings where women would show off factory-made clothing that they bought and embroidered Ukrainian embroidery on. That's such a wonderful tradition. I wish that still existed. And so we have an example with this wedding dress and with this little black dress, one of many in the show. And then another point of fascination for people, although it's shocking how many young people have never heard of Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin, I'm discovering, is this section right here. I have to find a way to plug my computer in to show you, but I'm going to set this down on the floor, Natalka, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about those jeans and what's going on here.
So throughout those earlier portions of the show, we are seeing examples of how fashion designers were adapting traditional silhouettes for their audience, and how Ukrainian communities were adapting their own designs and embellishing garments that were produced for the mass market. And in the 60s, once again, like in the 20s, Ukraine becomes part of a cultural mental map. And it becomes very fashionable at that time to adopt bohemian style of dress. And so everybody is wearing Afghani sheepskin coats or Japanese kimono or Chinese embroideries, Indian prints, and of course, Ukrainian clothing becomes a part of that kind of smorgasbord of design and style. And here in the show, we have some very special jeans that were worn by a Ukrainian Canadian jeweler from Toronto. His name is Ivan Kotulski, and he designed his own blue jeans. There's a picture beside those blue jeans of Ivan in front of the Winnipeg legislature, and he's got Janis Joplin in his arms because Janis Joplin was traveling across the country. There was a rock tour that crossed the country, and there's Ivan holding Janis, and there's Jim Morrison in his embroidered shirt. We could do a whole show just on celebrities, influencers dressed in Ukrainian embroideries, because they come in and out of fashion in a cyclical way. And when you want to do something different, you might want to put on something with a very intricate and beautifully executed design on a piece of clothing. And Jim Morrison thought that worked for him. Apparently, Ivan was a young man about town. The ladies enjoyed his fashion sense and bought his jewelry. Um, and that's that 60s corner. It became fashionable at that time, as Jen said, to adapt traditional patterns onto contemporary clothing. And we have a few examples. What I love about that section is that we have a suit there that is from the Oscar de la Renta company. And when people see it, they think, oh, that's their grandmother's suit, something that she wore to church. But actually, it's Oscar de la Renta. So these patterns and this fashion conversation takes place and appears in very unexpected very unexpected moments of production. Here we are. Here's this suit. When we were showing this suit in Winnipeg, people were shocked that this is Oscar de la Renta. It looks like a suit that could have been worn to church on Sunday or to a christening or to any kind of an event in the community that required celebratory clothing. Um, and here we have it. Here we have it in Neiman Marcus.
And so, Natalka, do you want to tell us a little bit about how Ukrainian men in Canada, kind of who had to tamper down their exuberance for color and design? What kinds of things did they resort to still maintain some aspect of Ukrainian identity in their clothing?
I in this show, men take a secondary role, though in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian traditional culture, men were peacocks, and they enjoyed the pleasure of culture, of cut and texture and beading, embroidery. They were allowed to shine. But here in Canada, men very quickly, because they were going into a marketplace that was hostile to traditional clothing, they quickly adopted Western wear. And so they're in suits, ready-made suits and ready-made clothing. But the women also didn't forget about their husbands. And so we have some examples there of beading, for example, that was adapted for menswear. And so men often wore beaded ties. And here we have two examples of very vibrant beaded ties.
And the watch fobs always fascinate me because those you can hide
Yes,
and just
yes,
pull out as almost as a like it's like something so covert. It's almost like you can flash it to someone to say, yes, me too, right?
yes, it is a bit of a Me Too kind of an object. They're
Mm-hmm.
called cotiglione, and they're little beaded. They're little beaded uh, objects that you would attach to your suit. And yes, it's a way of flashing. Uh, it's a way of signaling to other people that you have somebody who can create something beautiful for you, and it's a way of saying, well, this is me.
Mm-hmm.
um, Behind you you have a bullet belt, and that belt was actually one of the jewelry pieces that Ivan Kotulski created. It's made from spent cartridges. If you remember, the 70s were really a time when there was a very fierce battle over the pros and cons of the Vietnam War. I think Yvonne was on the nay side, and this belt is a kind of ironic make love, not war kind of a fashion accessory. I think the clasp has a wonderful sort of a butterfly at the end of the war. Yes. So, you know, certainly when you wore that Western suit, which was something that was worn in Ukraine as well, one way that you signaled a kind of Ukrainian identity often was tied to embroideries, jewelry embroideries, things like tabakiana. People had special cigarette cases with embroidery on metal, for example, or on wood. And so the men were not forgotten, but they are not the stars, alas, in this show. They deserve their own show. There's lots of things going on the men's side.
We have a couple of other things for men in the outerwear section.
Yes.
Maybe very briefly about these sorochke revisited.
Okay. One thing that we can identify in this show are the sort of periods, the fashion cycle. So there is a fashion cycle that we're following in this show, and this cycle has been generated by politics and culture in independent Ukraine. And so after the Orange Revolution, after Jean-Paul Gaultier went to Kyiv and did his, I think, really exceptional rethinking of traditional Ukrainian clothing and bringing it to the French and Western market. You got a real interest, a renewed interest in Ukrainian culture in the fashion industry. And after 2014, in 2014, every major European and North American fashion house did fashion collections that gave a nod to that tradition. And so behind you, you have a dress from Max Mara Sport. We have a blouse from Hermes in Paris. At that time, Jean-Paul Gaultier was the designer. And after he came back from Ukraine, in all the collections that he designed, he would use the raglan cut of a traditional Ukrainian sorochka. And in this case, what he did was he used poppies, a poppy textile, and for the embroidery motifs, he used the traditional logo that Hermes adopted in the 19th century, and he used that as the embroidery pattern. Beside him, we have a very, I would say, a very loud Lanvin, a Lanvin blouse, which, you know, a lot of my friends who don't like traditional Ukrainian clothing, they find it maybe a bit vulgar. But when you look at this Lanvin version, it is loud. It's loud. And above it, we have a little Miu Miu blouse right here on the top. So very different fashion sensibilities, very different designers, but each of them takes a crack at an embroidered blouse. And they come up with some wonderful designs.
So I want to touch on two more areas of the show. And one of them, when we talk about sort of the migration of fashion, the migration of culture, one of the, I think, really important sections of the show is looking at all of these necklaces and earrings and all sorts of pieces of jewelry made out of coins. And we know from picture books, how many Ukrainian women wore. I mean, we love our beads, but all the coin necklaces as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
I wanted when I was doing the show, I wanted to ask and answer certain questions, and one of the questions is what's Ukrainian. And if you look at what we accept as traditional Ukrainian clothing, as I mentioned previously, we often look to the Poltava region, a Kyiv region, central Ukraine, as the kind of definitive Ukrainian uh, uh, fashion or definitive costume. And one of the accessories that is always present in that costume are dukachi. And so we think of it as really traditional Ukrainian, traditionally Ukrainian um, accessory. But what I wanted to know was how is an Austro-Hungarian coin or a Russian ruble a Ukrainian piece of fashion? And when I started thinking about it, I started to think about coin jewelry. And the more I studied it, the more I understood that coin jewelry is something that is um, interpreted and adopted all around the globe. And so in this showcase, we have examples of coin jewelry from India, from the Caribbean, Guatemalan coin jewelry. We have Spanish coin jewelry produced in the Spanish sphere of influence. We have English coin jewelry, European, French. Um, we have both sides of the imperial divide in Ukraine. We have the traditional Ukrainian Austro-Hungarian coin jewelry that was worn in the west of the country, and the rubles and kopecks that were used in eastern Ukraine. But also we have, for example, Navajo coin jewelry, um, and it's high fashion and variant. So really, coin jewelry goes back to the Byzantine Empire. And it was used as a form of decoration even back then. And so high-end jewelers, for example, in the 1960s, they had a renewed interest in the use of old coins in modern settings. And so companies like Bulgari, for example, made a killing on their coin jewelry. So I just wanted to make a context for the Ukrainian Dukach, which is its own tradition. And of course, it's Ukrainian because Ukrainians made it their own. A lot of things that we think of as traditional uh, come from a marketplace that is bringing new materials and new textiles, new technological changes into the Ukrainian space. And Ukrainians are in the villages, in the towns, in the cities. They are making this their own. So that's the coin jewelry. We're part of a family.
What I love about this show is the way it frees us up culturally to understand Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian tradition, just like all other cultures and traditions, as something that was always in motion and always evolving and always borrowing and always inspiring. And when we first started talking about the show, Natalka, we had a number of conversations about how to start the show, and one of your points was Ukrainian clothing isn't your Ukrainian clothing tradition isn't what you think it is, right?
Yes.
So we discuss this extensively, and we do end the show on that note, and that's with this frame that has your grandmother's apron in it, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that. But I'll show this apron. It's very old, very beautiful, and Natalka's grandmother, right?
And my mother.
And your mother. And it certainly looks different from family photos in my family. And I think it looks different from anything we had in the museum prior to this in terms of what Ukrainians looked like 100 years ago. And yet at the same time, we have these photos from our collection of those women with their beautiful aprons as well, which are not black and red embroidery at all. And then these wonderful textiles from Osredok. So maybe you can tell us, and right next to this Tory Burch dress. So the color on my computer is not great, but if you were here in person, I encourage everyone to come. The colors here with sort of navy blues and rich reds and pops of yellow and cream, they all work together magnificently. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your grandmother's apron.
So again, at the beginning of the show and at the beginning of the concept for the show was the question, what is Ukrainian fashion? What is Ukrainian culture? What is Ukrainian design? And this apron is an example. When what I tried to do was open up the lens. I think in order to appreciate the collection, for example, in Saskatoon, you need to place it in a broader context. And for me, this apron is an example of the broader context that these beautiful textiles were being created in. That apron was part of um, an outfit that my grandmother wore. And it is an example of something that fashion historians have called Russian town gown. My mother was from northwestern Ukraine, from Polisia, close to the Belarusian border. And she lived in a part of Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire prior to the First World War. This style of clothing was very popular throughout the Russian Empire, and it was worn from Warsaw, which was then um, uh, influenced by the Russian Empire, all the way out to Vladivostok. And it is in itself it's a little example of how global trade influences and shapes local and national culture. So if you look at the patterns in that, apron, they are patterns that are very familiar to anybody who is looking at embroidery in Western Europe. And these designs were popularized by companies like soap companies and perfume companies, and companies that were selling thread, factory thread, into the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian Empire. And what women were doing at that period is that they were taking factory materials. In this case, it's silk. And it is embroidered in these DMC thread. And the patterns are based on Western patterns. But what is interesting is that they really have a local and national influence. So the women who are wearing the costumes in Vladivostok, the women who are wearing the costume in Samara, and my grandmother have costumes that have really big regional variations. And they wore it because they considered it to be beautiful, and they wore it because they wanted to signal their status. Fashion is about power and status and belonging, signaling belonging. And this was something that you would be wearing if you wanted to show your status in that society. The apron itself is an example of how fashion is adaptive. So it journeyed from the 19th century to immigration through DP camps to the United States, where my aunt took it with her in her immigrant journey. And she then took that apron, which was long and which fell to the floor, and she adapted it to in the 50s and 60s evening wear. When she entertained, she would put on one of those Dior new look dresses with a very tight waist. So we're back to the waist as an emphasis, a point of emphasis. And she wore this. She wore this apron to show her good taste, and because it pleased her. So fashion is a conversation. I wanted to show that Ukrainians have been integral to the conversation around what is beautiful and what women should wear for over 126 years, 150 years. Um, the waves of Ukrainian immigration have left their mark on Western fashion, and I wanted to show some of the examples of that. I wanted to this show is a Valentine to all those women who created the textiles and who embroidered the clothing, who cut it and sheared it and smocked it and appliqued it and wove the and pleated it, tucked it, who took ready-made fashion and made it their own. It's a Valentine to the women of the museum, Ukrainian Museum of Canada, and all the work that they and love that they placed in their collection. And it is a call for all of us to have another look. And to think again about what Ukrainian culture has to offer in the field of design and fashion. I think that in this fifth year of the war, a lot of that kind of interchange has become present in our Western culture. It's a lot easier to talk about these topics now because we're part of that mental map now. And so the days of sort of saying, well, we have something to offer, and sort of being sidelined, I think that sort of marginality seems to be has taken a bit of a hit. So that has changed. Um, but I hope that my show inspires people and takes them to the museum, takes them to think, uh, gets them to think about fashion, about who decides what's beautiful, who decides what we wear, um, and why we wear it. Um, and I am privileged to have been part of this show. I want to thank Jen and the people at the museum who did such a wonderful job in terms of the display and who helped with putting together a newly edited version of this show for the Saskatoon and Canadian audience. If you're interested, there will be an essay that will be accompanying this show where I explore some of these ideas in a more focused way.
Natalka, write a book, and we're encouraging her to do so. We have some time for a few questions. There's so much. There's so much information in this show. I do want to say, Natalka, that you kind of closed it on a similar note that I would have. That right now this seems like just such a perfect moment for this exhibition. Also, because we have these meetings between Ukrainian newcomers as a result of the invasion and folks like me who descend from the first wave of immigration, and we get to have these conversations about what is Ukrainian culture, because sometimes we're from different worlds, it seems. And so what this exhibition does is it actually allows, I think, parties on both sides to understand kind of the trajectories and the stories and the values in Ukrainian fashion, which was such a big part of our heritage. Really, the clothing is such a big part of our heritage, whether it's through Ukrainian dance or Vyshyvanka Day or just things that we have that we love because they remind us of where we come from. And so I think this exhibition really opens doors for conversations between these different Ukrainian communities. And in the past, I worked a lot with Indigenous communities and Indigenous youth. And, sometimes we would get into debates, the kids would get into debates about what's the real Indigenous, if you speak the language, or if you grew up on the reserve, or if both your parents were Indigenous, or what is it? And, because of colonialism, the conclusion that we would come to with kids was always like, it's all equally legitimate. Because, this is what the colonialism and displacement does to people, is that it gives us all different relationships to that identity. And I think this show allows us to talk about that as, we've so many waves of immigrants to Canada now from Ukraine, and especially with newcomers here, it's all Ukrainian, right? And it's never been static, and it's never been pure either.
Yes, I don't think it's static, and I think that it's important to. I think the context is so important, and I for one am very heartened by the ability of Ukrainian culture makers, designers, to adapt the latest and the best to their own needs.
Mm-hmm.
I am, it's if you are creative, if you're used to using anything that comes within your purview in a creative way, you can make a wonderful wreath, for example, out of cardboard. And only when you come up close and you have a look do you see that the most humble paper has been elevated to something that's quite wonderful. So, I really enjoyed seeing Ukrainian culture in that kind of larger context, and I think that we need to be generous in terms of our ideas around culture.
We have a comment from Marussia Patrician. Brava to the museum and to the curator, Natalka, for a very interesting show. Thank you for the Zoom opportunity. It makes me want to go to Saskatoon. You should come to Saskatoon. The show is going to be up until August 28th. We are open Wednesday to Saturday, 10 to 5. And open by special request. We had a surprise visit tonight, in fact, from the Saskatoon Photographers Club, who showed up at the front doors just as we were about to start the Zoom call. So those are the folks you see wandering around. So we sometimes open our doors when we're supposed to be closed to the public too. So anytime you want to come to Saskatoon, you're very welcome. And Eleanor says, it's super interesting. We'll definitely visit the exhibition. If we have any questions, you can post them in chat, or you could turn on your mics and ask a question to Natalka. But maybe nobody has questions. We will. I will tell you that
I do.
Oh, we do. Yes, Danya. Yes.
Yes, Natalka. I was just curious. What are your feelings and your thoughts on how designers who used Ukrainian patterns in their fashion, did they give credit to Ukrainians for using those designs? And is that a form of cultural appropriation? And I was kind of thinking of two things, that maybe in one way it was an advertisement of Ukrainian vyshivankas, but without, if they didn't mention it, not everybody would know. But, my question is about cultural appropriation. Your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, this show, which is largely a show that features Western fashion, of course, raises the question of cultural appropriation. And it is a big and complicated discussion. Mostly, I would say that most of the fashion companies that are featured in the exhibit, I don't think they have ever said, well, this is a result of being inspired by Ukrainian culture. So no, I don't think that I don't think that a lot of this fashion has been attributed to the local genius of the women who have created such a wonderful cultural archive. I would say, however, that I myself find the fact that these designers have turned to this body of work for inspiration heartening. I'm very happy that Western designers have discovered this work, and I enjoy seeing how they reinvent that material. I think that one of the problems that the fashion industry has in terms of cultural appropriation is that it does not use its profits to support the study of fashion history and of the cultures that it is borrowing from. So when Poiret, for example, the famous pre World War I French couturier, was borrowing from the Middle East and from China and from Japan, from India, from Eastern Europe, he would say, "This is my genius," and it takes a genius to find the design and to rethink it. But I think that Poiret and and the industry as a whole has a responsibility to save, conserve, study, and to display this body of women's work. To acknowledge the genius that has produced this body of work, and that they should be gifting museums and cultural institutions, universities that are working with this material, that they should be gifting them with money. And that's my sort of answer to the cultural appropriation part of it. Current Ukrainian designers are part of this kind of cultural appropriation discussion too, and there are many in Ukraine who are very critical of designers who go into a museum and then reproduce a piece and then label it as their own genius, as opposed to saying, well, we found this beautiful pattern at the Honchar Museum, and this is such and such a village that produced this beautiful work. You know, industry is industry, and you know, our attention spans in the digital age are very short. And would, if a designer, if Ralph Lauren took his indigenous designs and on each garment had a label that said this is inspired by Navajo rugs, would we pay attention? I think that companies like Ralph Lauren, for example, under pressure from the Indigenous community, have responded to the arguments for acknowledgement of kind of a kind of cultural theft. But even when you do that, does it actually answer the problem of seeing the larger body of Indigenous culture and how we interact with it? I think it's a more complicated problem than simply fashion designers putting out collections 6 times a year. And therefore looking for novelty in cultures outside of their own sort of narrow cultural space.
And if I can jump in there, I think one of the things we don't really write about in this show, but we do. There's a section we talk about the transition from linen to denim production. You know, whereas linen, you know, originally was homegrown and homespun and home woven. We moved into slavery capitalism and the production of denim that became the working class fabric. And I think one of the things that, you know, I maybe this will be explored in your essay, Natalka. But you know, when clothing moves from I mean, fabric, the metaphors of fabric, the metaphors like the fabric of our lives and things being woven together. Fabric really, textile production really underwrites our civilization, all civilization everywhere, and we tend to think of it in terms of, you know, technology, like the steam engine or something like that. But it really is textiles. And I think that, you know, one of the things we don't talk about in this show really is like the meaning of the symbol. So we move from, we're looking at clothing as an idea of exchange of ideas, as travel, geographies, status as well, inspiration, but the symbols that are the meaning of the symbols, there's love in there, is what I want to say, is that when we start thinking about status too much, we forget about the love of the original, you know, the protective symbols that would be embroidered into clothes. And so there's many layers to this onion. We could peel it, just keep peeling it forever. But you know, I actually think this show could be you know, it could be 10 shows. We could write this show 10 different ways, and it would always be an amazing exhibition, because these, you know, this just is such an important and an essential part of culture, of human life, right? And in the world we live in today, we forget about it because we go and we, you know, buy it at Joe Fresh or something like that. But it's there's so much history and so many millennia of women making these things and putting their love into it. Like it's extraordinary. And Natalka, I want to thank you for opening my eyes to all of this, because I've come to think about these histories of clothing in a completely different way that I never would have had the opportunity to do if it hadn't been for your presence here and your curating of this exhibition. It's just been extraordinary for all of us. And I think it will help us to tell stories in different ways at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada for a long time to come. And maybe you'll be a part of those too. But it's just been a really huge gift to us.
Well, the pleasure has been mine. I think that it is this show. It consists of many threads, And that thread, that final thread of the material nature of the show is an interesting one, and we do see that technological and economic revolution in the form of clothing throughout that show, and the movement from linen, home sewn, home reaped, home woven, to the H&M, fast fashion transition to that period in this show. I think that ironically, because fast fashion has delivered so much, I think there seems to be a hunger that I see within the culture for the artisanal product. So once again, I think people are very interested in the hand and the eye, and the intimate relationship with what we wear, what we eat, how we live. Once again, we're sort of thinking about those things as a society. So, technology, it can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. And it is, it freed the women who came here, who didn't have to reap and sew and weave and work so hard to produce textiles. It freed them from that. But there are downsides to it. Those mountains of garments that have been polluting our globe. you know that's the that's the dark side of that kind of technological bounty. And so this show has this show is a question with many layers, and it raises many questions. And yes, you could have 10 shows out of this.
Yeah.
Simply talking about the technological revolution that period encompasses is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
But luckily we got to work with this wonderful collection in Saskatoon. And thank you, Jen, for your creativity and your input. And thanks very much to the team in Saskatoon. They really are a treasure. If you're not a member of the museum, please sign up.
Yes, thank you.
Please do take out a membership. I think you will enjoy the newsletter and the programming that they put together. When we were starting the show, I came to Saskatoon, and I really enjoyed the show that you curated. Excuse me, featuring the art of Igor Dmitruk.
And that show is going to be in Toronto. Opening from June till October. We'll do a slightly smaller version to fit their space at Ukrainian Museum of Canada Ontario branch. So I'm excited about that.
I would urge everyone in Toronto to come and see the show. It is really, it was an unexpected pleasure. And I think that my fellow Edmontonian, Igor Dmitruk, is worthy of attention and worthy of the hand of a curator like yourself, Jen.
Well, thank you. So we're going to wrap it up here. For anyone who's in Saskatoon now or is planning on being here on April 25th, we're going to have an in-person talk by Rachel Ormshaw, who was responsible for a great deal of the exhibition design of this show. And it's really a stunning exhibition with the patterns on the wall and the didactics and the oversized didactics. And so she'll be leading a talk about the design process. And she's a weaver herself and a textile person, so she'll be able to talk about the clothing as well. So that's on Saturday, April 25th from 2 to 3 p.m. here at the museum. We will record it and we will put it up on our YouTube